Hi, everyone. People are starting to filter in here. I know I was just on another call with Gregory, so I think he's on his way over, and I see Austin's just pulling in.
Morning, Will. Morning, Will. Morning, Austin.
Hi, everybody. Good
Morning,
morning.
Dave.
Greetings, greetings.
Oh, Corey's here too. Nice. Hi, Corey.
Corey, I just invited you up on stage. While we're waiting for Gregory to, I think, round out our digital panel here, I wanted to draw attention to a couple things, or to one thing at least. Loa Labs put up yesterday, but in Discord. You can find it on our Twitter as well. We're working on a framework. We call it the Circular Funding DAO, an accountability DAO, essentially for community spends that would release tranches of funding to approve community spends based on milestones met. And would love for just some feedback. It's in Commonwealth. It's in on our on the Regen Discord, and just want to get people's thoughts that with that as a kind of added layer to governance around community spends in particular, to help just ensure that any community spends are meeting their objectives, and commensurate funding is applied evenly over time. So would appreciate that if you could take a look and have a thought. But otherwise, yeah, I think today we're going to kind of explore a few different places. We were talking, we're going to talk with Austin. He's got a beautiful piece on his Mirror account that's been posted on Regen Foundation, in his personal Twitter account. Around connecting the digital and ecological worlds, to put it very oversimplified, but Austin's going to elaborate there. We're going to talk about permissionless credit class creation, maybe dig into the technical side of that as well. So we'll be doing a little bit of a balance of the two today. And before we get going, did you have anything you wanted to draw attention to, or Austin, for that matter, just more broadly, before we dive into the topics?
Well, I guess one thing to say is that there was just a conversation in the hour before about a tokenomics working group. There's someone, Max Semenchek, who's from the Token Engineering Commons community, who's stepping into the core steward role for this tokenomics working group, or what we could call the Regen Ministry of Economics, to use Gregory's language. So Max wasn't able to join this call today, but you should all be hearing more soon from Max, and there should be some more news to share there soon, and an invitation for kind of public engagement around some of this token design, token upgrade process.
That is exciting news. Really stoked to hear about that. It's been I think, a long time coming, and thank you, Will. I know you've been helping shepherd that conversation, so very helpful. I can also just flag a couple things that are moving. We are getting into event season, everybody. Very exciting. So we're sorting out, we're kind of some of the Regen network development, Regen Foundation teams will be showing up in the fall. There are a number of options, from the UN General Assembly to Climate Week, to COP28 in Dubai, and a number of kind of sub events that are related to those. So just know that that's on our radars. Certainly would welcome feedback if you have anything moving on your side from the event perspective. Obviously, we're always looking to have Regen community members speaking at various events and spreading the good word. And a big shout out to Sarah Baxendale from R&D, who's I think has several presentations out in Europe right now at ECC and OsmoCon and the Nebular Summit and whatnot. In most cases, giving demos of credit, I think around credit class origination or groups module. So that's exciting. I'm appreciating we're moving quite deeply into actually demoing things versus just talking about big pictures, because we have in-market working products, and now we're just showing people how to use them. So, Gregory, I just invited you to be a host. If you want to join us up on stage, so join us when you can. How should we start today? I'm actually open to kind of the order of things. I know we do have Corey and Ryan here. Maybe we start there, depending on time.
That sounds good.
Awesome. So why don't we start? Greg will be joining us in a sec here. But Corey, I don't know if you have the ability or interest to come up. If you do, you just want to request to speak. I did extend a speaker invite to you. And we could talk a little bit about the technical side of permissionless credit class creation. Are you there, Corey?
Yeah,
Corey,
cool.
there you are.
Sounds like this works.
Greetings. Yeah, great. And looks like Gregory's up here. So why don't we jam a bit on permissionless credit classing, credit class creation. Welcome to the stage, Gregory. I don't know if you want to tee this up more formally. We were just talking about doing a 1-2 of the permissionless stuff, and then moving over to digging in with Austin.
Awesome. And I think there's actually a deep intersection that I just want to call out. I think in some ways, although we're going to do both a technical overview of what this means, and also kind of a process overview, value proposition overview of the relationship between Regen registry as a process, as a standards body, and this idea of sort of community-driven permissionless credit class creation, because I think it's really important to kind of like land that for the community, and then for the outside, for Regen network customers and stakeholders. And I think there's a deep thread which connects to what Austin, I believe, is going to be leading us through, which is sort of an exploration of the different types of governing ecological oracles as a community process, as a DAO process. And what permissionless credit class creation enables is removing the bottleneck that R&D, specifically Regen Network Development, Public Benefit Corp, presents to different communities defining their own crediting standards. We can still enable it, and we can still partner, and we can still certify for quality and collaborate in that, right? But also, we don't have to. And we've always thought that was really important to sort of avoid the bias of a specific organization when we're trying to create a plurality of different eco credits. And so that digging into that sort of from the value proposition, community proposition lens, I think is going to be really exciting a little bit later. I think probably it's worthwhile, while we have Corey and Ryan and other technical folks on the call, because I know I'm not sure, but you all may need to dip into other things, that we sort of start with an exploration of what does permissionless credit class creation mean from a technical perspective. But I just wanted to call out that there is kind of this deep intersection with the work that Austin is leading and the thought piece that they recently published, and this kind of present governance conversation and network upgrade.
Nice tee up.
Yeah. So, Corey, do you want to just kind of, can I pass the mic over to you to, both? I mean, I think it'd be lovely if you could give an overview sort of from the value proposition, product, philosophical lens as well about what this means. Because I know you've also been pretty passionate about this from what, sort of like the network owning these core processes and value propositions, and then kind of bridge that into the technical overview of what does this really mean that credit class creation is becoming permissionless.
Yeah, sure. And I don't know, from my perspective, this is, we've got this post up on Commonwealth now. It's starting to see some engagement, which is good. But I'd really love to make sure that during this time, or if there isn't time for it today, we find another time where really people can also just be asking questions too, because I don't know to what extent folks have already been reading it, maybe have some thoughts, some questions, concerns, ideas, stuff that they'd like to talk through with us. To me, it's being here in the context of like a Twitter Spaces is just as much about that and that conversation as it is about us sort of like explaining the context and the thinking behind our initial, provocation to put this up for a governance vote. Um, okay, so what permissionless credit classes means? I think it's first just worthwhile to like position that alongside the context of Regen Registry and make sure that people are understanding what we're Regen Registry has been evolving to basically be where R&D has been, where our organization has been putting our efforts into a rigorous and like sort of vetted program for partners wanting to engage in the supply process, so to speak, of producing eco credits, where they're going through a whole bunch of checks and balances with our team. We're coaching projects and methodology developers and through the process of designing what a methodology would look like. And then also, just having assurances that everything from like, land tenure is being verified to, there are legal agreements in place, all of that stuff, which is really important for the, that's kind of like that sort of stuff is pretty often in place in the context of voluntary carbon markets. But what's interesting about Regen Network is we've sort of paired that model and just plopped it on top of a proof of stake network, which is a permissionless network where anybody who's holding the Regen token has sort of a stake and a say in the governance of the network. And so what the way that credit class creation has been happening historically is that nobody has basically been allowed to engage in that creation process unless they go through a full network-wide vote to be added, to have their wallet address added as one of these special addresses that can create credit classes and instantiate new, issuance bodies, basically, for certain types of carbon credits. And to date, Regen Registry has been the only body that has applied and been given access by the community to basically be one of those allowed credit class creators, is what we call them. That model has been great, I think, for the past couple of years. It's really gotten us off to a start where we've seen sort of the first couple of credit classes and types of carbon credits that have come on chain, and the soon non-carbon credits that our team has been working on bringing onto our network, are all ones that we're really excited about, where the bar is quite high, and where we feel like there's a lot of assurances in place, legally and whatnot, to make sure that everything is done the right way, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not to say that those assurances aren't ones that always need to be in place, but in a typical kind of proof of stake or blockchain permissionless ecosystem, there is a proliferation of an ability for other organizations and other entities to kind of emerge with their own kinds of standards bodies and their own kinds of rules for what kind of safeguards and agreements need to be put in place to allow for that. So with that, we're putting up a proposal to actually disable this this sort of governance gating functionality for the initial credit class creation process. And what that would mean in effect is that Regen Registry would still be operating, and everything, we've been working, and as you can read in the proposal, with all sorts of ways that we would upgrade our user experiences to, really make sure that on the front page of everything are the credits that are running through our registry program that we're assured, have this have been through these checks and balances that we think are important, but that at the network layer, it's probably the right move to have that be something where people can create new types and new standards and new protocols for issuing ecological assets without having to go through a system-wide governance process just to have their address on the allow list. And so that's what this change is about. There's a couple of other things that, downstream of that change, we also need to be thinking about, like what are the allowed credit types on Regen Network? Is it just carbon? Is it a bunch of other ones that we want to load in? Also, there is still a fixed fee in Regen that users must pay when instantiating a credit class that I think gets burned. So there are some downstream things for us to talk about, but the most important thing is just this changing of the kind of gating, the governance gating for anyone to be able to participate in that creation process, so to speak, at the network level. Personally, it kind of feels to me that if Regen is a proof of stake network, for people to really actually feel like as a token holder they have some say and some control, it's kind of it's close, but it's not quite enough. That the supply process still needs to go through a governance process with every new address that wants to instantiate credits onto the network. And so, I believe that this kind of puts this, if you think of Regen as a two-sided marketplace, this puts the supply side of the marketplace a bit more explicitly in the hands of the people who are controlling consensus, which is the token holders. And there's obviously some risks in that. We don't want people to go wild and crazy, or we're hoping that the community takes this responsibility seriously, and that we can still have some safeguards in as much as burn fees that kind of prevents the activity. But this is a big move for the community, and so it's something that we kind of really need to be so that folks feel kind of like excited and sort of intrinsically like this is also the right direction.
So just to draw out a few key points there and maybe go a little bit deeper. So one of the most important, I guess, nuances that you're pointing to is that although there's a move to not having token holder gated governance, or token holders gate the instantiation of a credit class, there is still going to be token holder gating of credit types, in which there's a specific on-chain unit, and that discussing that and there's sort of like three different possible directions that we may go as a community, right? And just interrogating that a little bit and understanding the dimensions of that together is important. So that's like one important point. I also wanted to just bring up or ask, what is the functionality and vision at the intersection of, I guess, eco credit module and the group module? Again, kind of referring back to the conversation with Austin, in that, we're not trying to create a system that has no curation, certification, or quality control. We're just wanting there to be a plurality of approaches around that, right, to instantiate new credits. So, I want to dig in on that deeper, because I think that's important for the product vision. But first, let's just talk through again this credit type, on-chain credit type, and the options available to us. So option number one is that right now in the current governance proposal, we sort of do an omnibus thing where we if the community wants, we both go for permissionless credit class creation, and we sort of preload a set of credit types beyond just carbon, which is the first one that's up there. And some candidates that I proposed in the forum were using the lexicon of the lexicon working group's ecological benefit framework to just say those are the initial types, and maybe an environmental stewardship type, which is a very active and vibrant corner of the Regen network community. That's one option. Another option is that we continue to have governance gating types, right? So people need to come and sort of say, this is why we want this type on chain. Here's how it's, defined. Here's how it's going to be sort of verified in the types of credit classes that are going to be using it. And the third way is that we choose a different approach to preload than sort of like one of those different and maybe more limited. Like maybe we just source from the credits that we know are coming through Regen Registry right now, right? Because there is a set of credits coming through Regen Registry which don't represent the totality of possibilities, and we just sort of mine from those and put those up, kind of saying, hey, we know these are coming up. We're using this as an opportunity to get those on chain. Do you want to comment any more about that, Corey? And I'm also just interested if anybody else has questions, both in the audience and folks here up on stage, about this specific point around credit types, because I think it's one of the more important nuances that kind of makes the shift to permissionless, in a way, kind of incomplete unless we approach it, in a specific way.
Can you talk a bit more about this lexicon framework? I remember you mentioning that in your response in Commonwealth, but I saw a link to the work that Sophia had done in that taxonomy, but I don't know if there was a link to the lexicon.
Yeah, I didn't have a link to hand. We should ask Tika, and I could sort of dig that up, and I'll sort of pledge to do a little digging and make sure that that's in the forum. But essentially, there's a working group that's funded by BXC, the Blockchain X Climate Group, which David Fortson and I are kind of co-founders, and Regen is one of the initial members of, and there's been a process with like hundreds and hundreds of people working in the domain of, I guess you could say broadly, ecological benefit accounting, that distilled a specific taxonomy of ecological benefits, and the first draft of that ecological benefit framework came from the taxonomy that Sophia created, right? And so it's sort of saying, hey, here are ecological benefits, and there are things like water quality, air quality, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, right? And so they're trying to create, and then subsections of that, they're trying to create kind of a universal reporting framework for ecological health benefits. And because there's just been a ton of work on it, and they kind of have tokenization in mind from day one, that's why I mentioned it as a possible suggestion for where we could basically be saying on Regen, those types of ecological benefits are all types of credits that you could mint, and that's essentially the one approach that we could take. Is that helpful context for you, Corey, and maybe for other community members as well? You're on mute. There you go.
So there be like, I'm wondering if there would be like explicit units then for each of these, because that's what, at the end of the day, what we need.
We would have to presume units, we would have to presume units, and there's it's an interesting quandary, and I'm actually kind of curious why we didn't bake unitization into the credit class structure. I mean, I guess this is a way that
we can talk about this.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I know Aaron had specific ideas, and you and I were talking about that, and I think you were going to ask Aaron some of his thoughts about this. How did that conversation go?
Well, units are like basically selected at the credit class level, but the whole context of what credit types are is basically a way to explicitly say that certain credit classes are related to each other because they're using the same unit.
In saying related, are you saying fungible? Like, is this the same as, like, are these units fungible or not?
So I don't want to say fungible, because fungible means that actually one can exchange one of unit X for another of unit Y. That's like, I think, let's use the analogy of wine. Just to say that we're standardizing on 750 milliliters doesn't mean that all bottles of wine are fungible. It means that when I say I have a bottle of wine and you say you have a bottle of wine, we know that there may be different bottles of wine, but we at least know that the amount of volume in them is exactly the same.
Got it. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. So it could be fungible. So it could be a way that the community programs fungibility through the basket module, but it might not be. But it might not be.
That's exactly right. But basically, it's like having two credit classes in our current architecture, having credit classes be in the same be of the same credit type and having the same unit is sort of a prerequisite for those credits to be used together in the same basket and therefore be fungible with each other. Now, there could be ways in which we extend baskets to move beyond that, but that would then require having some weights where you say, a carbon credit is worth X times as much as a biodiversity credit, which seems like a weird thing to do. And so this is why we don't want to presume that we're wanting to do that kind of
well, just for the record, I want to presume that we want to do that.
Well,
but I think it's a different thing than the basket. It's a different thing. I think what's important is I think we need to go there as a community, but that would be an index or not how we've conceptualized a basket, which is much more naive. It's just a way of exporting and creating exchangeability instead of something that's more advanced, which is like managing a portfolio of credits and giving people a share in that portfolio, which is a totally different thing. It moves that clearly would require a responsible party and or a decentralized protocol that generates the index formula and all these other things. That's a big product vision, which I'm sort of excited about, but that's not what we're talking about right now, for sure.
Yep.
Okay, so
does that clarify the units piece a bit?
Yeah, I mean it does.
Credit types basically are units. Like that's what when we say, we need to align on the credit types, it's like we just need to decide what are the ways that we're allowing for credit classes to have units attached to them.
So just to be opinionated for a minute and maybe check and see, do you have restraints about this opinion? My opinion right now is we should just pre-program in using the taxonomy that has been generated for ecological benefits, all of the units that we feel fairly sure are being used or will be used, and we should just get them up there so that that's simple and easy to use. What are the restraints, or what would be the reasons not to do that?
One reason that may be insufficient would be that someone may be wanting to have some specialized credit class with their own specialized unit,
but they could just go through governance to get that up, right? So there's there's a way to add, and so I don't think we should try to presume that. I mean, in a way, I think it's good to have I believe it's important and good to have restraint and due process around what the utility that Regen Ledger provides. I think that's important. But I also think we have a super clear idea about 80% of the units that the community is going to be using over the next couple of years. And then the 20%, there's a process. Currently, that process is an all token token holder vote. I think probably we want to take a step back, and again, this kind of intersects with the conversation I think Austin's going to be inviting us into, but I actually think we probably want to evolve the restraint or the governance process around the units to be a group, like a council that's like the ecological unit council and has a set of stakeholders who think deeply about that, and then you apply to them and they get it up on chain. But yeah.
And
could I ask a quick question here?
Yeah, Paul, go.
Something on the Commonwealth thread mentions making credit types optional, and I just don't think that's been. There's a couple other people asking in the thread about that, and it hasn't been expanded on. So I'm curious about that, as well as you mentioned like environmental benefits and stuff, and what happens when a project might have multiple of those, like, and are you limited to one unit, or would you be making like issuing multiple credits in that case?
Maybe can I start with the second one, because I feel like that's a bit
Sure.
maybe easier to just take off on its own. So the question is around multiple units. Yeah. Was there another part to that second question?
Right, where there's maybe a single piece of property and it may be performing. It may have
multiple benefits.
It may have multiple benefits.
Okay. So the way that currently at the end of the day, when like the eco credit module is conceived as a mechanism to be issuing semi-fungible units to people. So like there is at the end of the day, credit vintage corresponding to a certain project that you will have a number of credits in. And so that number has to represent something. There are two pathways to dealing with multiple kinds of quantified benefits that a project may engage in. One is to treat those as co-benefits at the sort of vintage or credit batch level. This is, I think, where what we're doing with most of the cases related to this in our for the methodologies that are enrolled in our registry, where we would just add that to the credit batch metadata, and it's part of the MRV process, and it's something that would get documented as such, and it would be in the metadata saying like, oh, by the way, in this batch there was also these kinds of measured co-benefits. And the thought is, I think that if you're a holder of 5 carbon credits in this batch of 20, then you also kind of you're not treating the co-benefits as an offset. Those co-benefits aren't on their own separately like tradable assets, but there's something that you kind of can say you participated in the financing of by holding and retiring the carbon credits from that vintage. And you would be able to see the measured co-benefits at that batch level shared amongst all credit holders from that batch. The other pathway is one where we've talked about in the past potentially having projects independent of credit classes. And right now, projects can only be basically only exist within the scope of a credit class. So a credit class issuer must instantiate projects and then can issue credits to those projects. But if you have credit class A and credit class B, each wanting to instantiate projects, those projects can't be the same project. We understand that to be like an insufficient architecture to our like end kind of goals, and have been for a while, understanding that we will shift at some point to an architecture where projects are things that can get instantiated on chain, probably in a permissionless way, and then can go through a process of applying to credit classes to enroll in certain credit classes. And this way, if you were a land project and you had some property boundary, you could create a project on chain representing your ecological work, and you could apply to a carbon credit that matched your ecosystem type, and you could also apply to a water quality credit. And then these would each be separate crediting programs that you would be enrolled in. You would be receiving like totally separate credits from different credit classes to your project. And in that case, they would be both separate assets that could be like sold independently of each other. So those are kind of the two ways that we think about like multiple benefits.
Can I interrogate that just a little bit more, Corey? So I think there's another way that it's like maybe complementary with those two ways of describing things, which is that you could also sort of include in the metadata of, for instance, a carbon credit, both the information about the co-benefits, but also potentially an agreement that if and when you retire the carbon credit, you could be eligible for being dropped sort of tokenized benefits beyond carbon, if that makes sense. So for instance, in the use case here, and you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, Corey, and a lot of this is sort of like, in a way, chain adjacent functionality, right? Which requires the credit issuer to be taking steps such as this and to be making agreements which are reflected, which can be reflected on chain with digital signatures and other things, but aren't yet going to be automated in a smart contract sort of way. But you could say have a Jaguar eco credit that includes any subsequent carbon rights at a certain percentage of the benefits that are generated by the conservation activity that is anchored by monitoring jaguar habitat health population density, but is noting that it could also be developing significant carbon benefits, and that if you're the holder of a retired Jaguar credit, you are eligible at a certain percentage of issuance for a certain period of time for carbon and whatever co-benefits come later that are to be tokenized. Does that make sense, Paul? And Corey, is there anything that I said there that is wrong?
I would just add I think that is definitely possible. It would require, basically, if those stipulations were explicitly made in, let's say, a Jaguar credit today, then, basically it would be a separate credit class, a carbon credit class that would later be sprung up. There would have to be the corresponding project still registered with that, unless we did this independent project architecture that I was talking about. But yeah, there definitely are ways that we've envisioned that being a process that could start social first, and with more robust technical implementations like later. So
well, I just want to say I can think of like 3 different projects that want this or are intending to do this with this sort of like social but agreement reflected on chain, right, in metadata, then moving to being able to specify and automate that, which I think I agree, that a core part of automating that, like hint, Paul, is on-chain projects. And on-chain projects being able to be linked to credit issuance at sort of of specific classes, and then we also get into this sort of are we creating functionality that allows credits to be sort of assembled or aggregated into bigger units or disaggregated? And currently, again, the way to do that, which I'm describing, is sort of like chain adjacent, which is you could just link issuances and promise of issuances and have a stacked benefit approach that kind of fits in with, I know, a lot of the work that we've been thinking about in Open Team, which is this like stacked benefit idea where you may have multiple benefits. I will say that there is some controversy amongst the, I guess, project developer and standards body community around this idea of being able to disaggregate and sell benefits to different stakeholders, or if you should force sort of a benefit monopoly, and like you buy one benefit, you get all of them, you get rights to all of them. So just to say that there is some, there's like debate on that, and I think what's most important is that we maintain clear lines of reporting around that, around who has what, so that you don't get essentially double counting. It does complexify our ability to keep track of that when you disaggregate claims. So Paul, any other questions?
No, that was great. Thank you.
I want to be attentive to sort of the next phase of the conversation. I'm going to give just a brief pause to see if there's any other audience members who have kind of questions specific to the technical implementation details of the existing eco credit module and how R&D is proposing to evolve the functionality or open the functionality through the shift to permissionless credits, and sort of the specific subtopic around how credit classes relate to credit types, which are also governance gated. So just giving a brief moment, see if people have questions, if you want to raise your hand, maybe if I could just ask for a little audience engagement, if you could use your little, emoji button to give me a thumbs up if you're tracking what we're talking about and it seems useful and grounded and you're gaining understanding, or a thumbs down if you're like, wow, I'm kind of confused right now, just to give us a sense of, technical detail and value generated through the conversation. Cool. Getting a couple thumbs up out there. Thank you. I appreciate it. So with that, I want to pass it over to you, Austin, maybe with a brief sort of like re-looping of this, which is to say, the idea, the core concept in a way of Regen Network is to use innovation, grassroots community governance at a bioregional scale to generate new credits that have strong social and scientific proof mechanisms, and to enable those tools to be widely distributed instead of centralized and bureaucratic. Right? That's one of the core value propositions. And so this phase shift into opening up and permissionless credit classes isn't really, at first glance, it's maybe, that's undermining the, in quotes, quality value proposition, which by forcing everyone through Regen registry is given. But on the other hand, there's something else happening where we're trying to invite other groups into defining quality on their own so that capacity can really drive regeneration and change. And I think that intersects really deeply with the work that you're doing and the thought leadership you're bringing to the community around what are the communities that are governing DAOs, what are they governing specifically, and how does it relate to eco credits? So with that kind of tee up, I want to pass it back over to you, Austin.
Sure. It's serendipitous. It's cool that the conversation around permissionless credit classes and this essay are happening at the same time. I think they definitely feed into each other, and it would be fun to do this sort of higher conceptual discussion thinking, not to say higher, but sort of more abstracted, paired with the technical as a sort of a duet that we do during other news hours. So kind of where to start. I think that the piece is in a way a synthesis of what has been really actively moving at the Regen Foundation, and in a way is trying to re-articulate some of the basic premises of Regen Network. So I don't claim to be the source of these ideas, but I see it as a kind of synthesis of what we're doing. And it's part of a larger series that explores the relationship of the economy and ecological systems and some of the larger ethical paradoxes that are presented there, and that we commonly get asked and discussed, or people present in their hesitation towards engaging in this larger question. And I think those challenges that I call in this piece the challenge of legibility are incredibly interesting and animating to the work. So I want to make space for them in an essay form. And essentially what the piece is trying to do is talk about how we spawn and structure a network of ecological state oracles, that are these essential interfaces by which the living world and what's happening with it, the health of a forest, the degree of replenishment of an aquifer, or whatever other sort of monitoring you might want to describe, how the state of the living world informs technical systems, whether it be like credit creation, whether it be through policy, debt for nature swaps, anything that kind of sits on top. And so I see this notion of how this network of oracles is basically the underlying building block for any future legal policy or economic framework that actually takes the state of the living world as an input. And I basically take the long route there by introducing DAOs as effectively a continuation of the commons movement, but capable of doing some really cool things that start to blur the lines between agency, but between people and humans and non-humans, or personhood can be for not just human beings. And that, in effect, what we've described as commons to date, which could be considered an old concept, although they've basically been eradicated and fenced, that I cover in the piece, that we think of commons oftentimes as biophysical things like fisheries or aquifers, etc., but that the data generated from the living world is also a commons. And that in the process of developing regenerative economic paradigms, we have to think about the state of the living world as a commons that's subject to the same kind of dilemmas around access and replenishment. So we've got biophysical commons like trees and leafy stuff, and then we have these data commons, which is effectively ecological state. And so what are those entities that steward both? They're hybrid digital ecological systems. And I think that entity is an incredible application for DAOs. And I think that we should be talking about DAOs as basically an extension of the commons, and that I basically spoof that web-based communities have been around forever, and that any web-based community is effectively, like an eco-social set of relationships. So the original web-based communities were commons, and yeah, that drives on top of all this other stuff. And it's certainly the substance of what we explore at the foundation about how to build that capacity. But just to kind of conclude this introduction, like when I describe DAOs to regenerative communities within indigenous nations, within like broadly land stewards, I always begin with the notion of it's effectively a commons that works with the data, the information about the environment on top of it. And so you steward both of them, and it clicks immediately for people. And so it's kind of come out of that time-tested pattern of explaining DAOs in the field many times over. And I'll just stop there in case anybody has any response to that. And I'm happy just to keep giving context and sort of walk through what's exciting to me, particularly in the piece, or if people can point something out that's animating to them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to kind of just ask a couple questions to draw out some dialogue here. So, one question that emerges listening to this, which is really exciting to hear your articulation or re-articulation of kind of this meta structure of that links governance, commons governance specifically to our mission. I'm wanting to link reweave that down to technological specifics, again kind of with the provocation that Regen Ledger itself is a commenting tool, and the governance processes we're going through are to upgrade and steward this tool, which is itself a digital commons, to be used for specific communities to govern their biophysical commons. And so we're having this conversation right now about the shift to permissionless credit classes, credit type, etc. You're bringing in this information and idea about kind of ecological state oracle processes and how that's a community process, can be conceptualized as a community process. I'm curious about, you know, what happens, where does your mind go when we think about this conversation through the commenting lens? The specific conversation about what are, for instance, what, if any, units do we preload, or do we maintain restraint that people need to go through in all community governance, or do we focus on innovating a new governance structure around that type of question? So that's number one. And also just like, so that's sort of the first dimension of the question. The second dimension of the question is, how close are we with the group module and eco credit module, basket module, kind of current Regen ledger functionality, to having what we need for minimum viable biophysical and sort of digital knowledge wisdom governance for communities engaged in ecological stewardship to be stewarding, producing, and producing ecological value. Like, how close are we with the existing tool set? What's the gap that we still have? Just kind of describing that a little bit, I think, would be really useful.
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy for anybody else
jump in here?
to hop in and give their take on this. Yeah, Corey, why don't you go first, and then I can respond to that.
Okay, it says looks like connection.
Yeah, Corey, you're breaking up for me a little. Austin still came through loud and clear, so I don't know.
What?
I think Corey's having connection issues, maybe.
Okay, I see the mic attempt is off, so I'll just take my stand at that, and then we can just let the conversation evolve from there. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a super interesting question. Like, to ground the language around credit classes and like proof of regeneration and the units and the credit types and things like that to some of the language in the piece in specificity has to do with this really kind of pivotal idea from the essay that has to do with ecological state and state, like to describe what the state of something is, and that the state of an ecosystem is a deterministic thing, that it's like not ambiguous what it is, and it has memory, it's composed of what's happened as events in the past, and that any kind of like unit or credit type or credit class is in effect sort of an articulation of ecological state, and that these commons are stewarding a dynamic but accurate depiction of ecological state. And that maps on really nicely to thinking about how as an on-chain native entity, we can talk about credit types or credit classes. And so I think that the larger questions, like every time in answering these questions, I think we're going to get met with like, well, it should be bioregionally driven. And probably to the end that there is a handful. I mean, like, I think the top has to touch the bottom, like from the grassroots has to touch like sort of the more structured, like ordered element of this equation, which is that there are certain units that people understand as legible, like they're charismatic or they have appetite within the green economy or the regenerative economy. And so when you're talking about preloading unit types and things like that, like I think that it should, default reflex answer is that should be bioregionally governed, like we say with almost everything at Regen. But at the same time, keeping and maybe not quite answering your question, but like spicing it up would be like, what units do people identify with and relate to as a meaningful reflection of ecological state, as a meaningful index of ecological well-being? And we should probably preload baskets, etc., with units and ecosystem benefits and credit types that are legible to people, as that they understand, like on an intuitive level, like through the biophysical functioning of Earth, that those are accurate reflections, but that they're also, dare I say, like likable, because accessibility socially and like charisma is still a part of this. People will lean towards and invest and spend time with things that they can relate to. And so the kind of question that it opens up around this much larger community owned and governed process is that, like, communities should, in a permissionless credit class issuance scenario, I would imagine communities will be developing credit classes that they identify with, that aren't just like ecologically or bioregionally relevant, but that is a certain reflection of an identity, like there's a historical relationship, and that those elements of the equation, I think we can't like undersell, because ultimately in this purchase, should this larger process like make it to being a credit that then is on a marketplace that's then purchased, like there's a relationship around mutually held value of what's important, and that unit is an expression of that, or as you might say, Gregory, like this is a unit of right relation that resonates with people. And so there's an interesting confluence of the sort of scientific dimension, the scientific rigor of it, with also a sort of identity politics and how people access what are reflections of right relation according to them. And so I wonder how we would preload with accurate reflections of scientific, like regenerative ecosystem management, while also really supporting this permissionless credit class process to support bioregions and communities to create credits that like represent them. And I think that's like essential in talking about a purchaser and an originator relationship. So I'll just put that out into the air. Maybe Corey's connection's improved or somebody else wants to jump in.
That's all great. I can try this again. Is this working better now?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I was going to speak a little bit just to the technical side, because Gregory, you were asking to what extent we have the tools, or do the tools that we have today serve the purposes of what Austin's talking about. And you were mentioning, the current way that we have the eco credit module and the groups module. I actually feel like with what I'm hearing from Austin, it may start first with a deeper look at people engaging directly with some combination of the groups module and the data module.
I agree.
If what we're talking about here, is starting with this idea of how oracles engage with the system, or how truth making sort of lands on Regen Network. What's really beautiful about at least the current instantiation of the data module is it also comes with this response. We currently have a built-in assumption that, like, you also in anchoring data on chain and in signing it, you also need to be pointing to where that data is being hosted. So, it's not just that someone needs to make a statement, but someone also has to kind of take responsibility for making that data in its full or in partial form, accessible to a broader community and to the public. And, that is something, just to be clear, whether it's the initial anchoring of data on chain or, adding different attestation signals to it, is stuff that not just can be done by individual addresses, but, can be done by group accounts. So to what extent, people do want to be forming councils, forming groups, forming different kinds of decision-making structures for nested ways of coming to consensus on, truth, on ecological state, and registering that on a network. Like, those tools are 100% there. We're still a bit from saying that they're like 100% available to the end user, but in terms of on-chain network functionality, they are 110% there. And I would love to see projects engaging with that. And in my mind, one way that I would love to see this stuff develop is like if you have, robust communities that are developing their own protocols and governance structures for just purely that kind of ecological state layer and, sense making, and registering that on chain, you can then have downstream of that, credit designers taking that that previous like ecological state by maybe a different group or a different entity or a different community as one of many inputs into a crediting process. And you know, that's where the real beauty, in my view, of Regen Network comes to shine through, is when, you know, you do have a rich of enough ecosystem where there's all sorts of stuff happening at the data layer, then actually each crediting process, you know, someone as a credit class designer or a methodology developer can be thinking not just about, you know, their own bespoke way of tailoring an MRV process to the landscape that they're working with and the land management practices, but also, you know, thinking through what ways they want to engage with the already existing plethora of data that, you know, is already coming to different levels of community consensus on the network.
Great. Well, we're just moving past the 12 p.m. Eastern, and whatever time in whatever time zone our friends are listening from, which marks the 1 hour point of the Regenerati News Hour. So just want to presence that. I'm going to need to hop off into the rest of my day. I think this has been a very dynamic and interesting conversation, and yeah, really appreciate Corey, you hopping on and sharing kind of the technical thinking and precision around what this governance process around permissionless credit classes is really entailing and what some of the important discussion points are for the community. And Austin, I really appreciate you continuing to kind of invite us into the kind of the structure of thought around the what and the why of how what we're doing is informing on the ground regeneration and the relationship between that and, you know, where we are at the moment with both the technology and the kind of piloting of things. So thank you both. And thanks to everybody. Paul, thanks for hopping up with your question, and Dave for hosting, and Will for being up here with us, and everybody else for listening. So I think with that, we'll probably close out the day. And